Before we begin, we find peace in forgotten histories and quiet resilience. Take a moment to subscribe. Let us know in the comments, what time is it where you're listening, and where in the world are you? Now, settle in. Tonight's story is not about battles or glory. It's about how an empire faded, not in flames, but in hunger and betrayal. Asterisk, in the twilight of the Roman Empire. When the marble was cracking and the statues were worn smooth by generations of pigeon droppings and rain, the fate of a city still, believed to be eternal, hinged not on war or on divine will, but on grain. Just sacks of grain. And one ship that never came. You can imagine the city's soundscapes, soft and gritty, more rustle than roar. Mules pulling carts of amphory, vendors calling out with wilted olives and small loaves of barley bread, the slap of sandals against stone, a rhythm unchanged since Augustus. But beneath the everyday noise was something else. Hunger, not the loud kind, the silent kind that builds quietly across seasons, when the bread gets smaller and the wine is watered down just a bit more than usual. By the late 4th century, Rome was not what it had been. The emperors were now shadows, flitting between cities in the east. The Senate still met, but more out of habit than power, and the population, once swelling near 1 million, had declined sharply, perhaps halved. Some scholars say cities. Aqueducts still carried water. The forums still held speeches. But everything was thinner, quieter, and far more fragile than anyone admitted. Rome depended on grain, not just as food, but as a promise. Since the days of the Republic, the unknown, the grain dole, was the spine of Roman political stability. Free grain, or deeply subsidized loaves, were how emperors kept the people calm. They could skimp on gladiator games, or delay bathhouse repairs, but not the grain. By the year 383 CE, that promise was fraying. The Western Empire was stretched thin. Invading Germanic tribes had begun to nibble at the borders. Tax revenues shrank. The countryside was scarred with conflict. In the vast system that once carried African grain to Roman mouths through harbors, warehouses, river ports, and millstones was crumbling. North Africa had been the breadbasket. Rich plains near Carthage produced endless rows of wheat and barley. Great ships with round bellies carried that grain across the Mediterranean, up the Tiber, and into the hungry heart of Rome. But that year, one of the largest shipments from Africa simply didn't arrive. It's not entirely clear why. There was no great naval disaster, no epic storm recorded in the annals. Just silence, a delay that stretched from days to weeks. And then, something worse shrugged from officials. The ship had vanished, or perhaps it had been rerouted, or intercepted, or never loaded at all. The records are sparse, full of fragments and hesitant guesses, but what followed is better documented. The bread ration was cut, not formally at first. Bakers began to thin their loaves, mixing in more bran or old grain. Bread that once had a nutty, full chew began to crumble too easily. Then the prices crept up. A loaf that once cost $1 as now cost $3, then $5, then $10. Food riots didn't erupt immediately. Rome's poor were used to indignity, but stomachs grow impatient. And as weeks became months, a strange mood settled over the city's resigned, simmering, brittle. Grain brokers blamed corrupt officials. Officials blamed the weather. Some blamed African farmers for hoarding, Others blamed the growing Christian bureaucracy, claiming they cared more for souls than stomachs. There were whispers that the missing ship had been diverted by a rival general. Magnus Maximus, the usurper in Gaul, had reportedly seized cargo to feed his own army, but no one confirmed it. Paper trails faded into ambiguity. What was certain is that bread lines grew longer. People who once sneered at the public dole now waited for hours under a soft winter rain, bowls in hand, eyes downcast. At the port, workers began to argue. Dark hands fought over rumor. I heard the ship is late. No, I heard it was sunk. It was sold to a merchant in Ravenna. The rumors were their own form of famine feeding the gnawing hunger with salt and air. And then came the thefts. Not grand robberies, but the slow erosion of civility. A sack of flour gone missing from the storehouse. A baker beaten in a dark alley. A priest found hoarding olives under his chapel floorboards. These weren't crimes of rebellion, but of survival, of tired people trying to stretch one more day, one more meal. We know from a letter written by a minor senator, Gaius Licinius Probatus, that the mood in the Curia was dry and thin. He wrote to his cousin in Ravenna, "The people are quieter now, not because they are content, but because hunger is a great muffler." His phrasing is almost poetic, but cruel in its observation. Hunger muffled the masses. It didn't ignite them, not yet. Probatus noted how even the stray dogs seemed more aggressive, fighting over spoiled scraps. They, too, seem to sense that something has broken, he wrote. The rhythm of the city is offbeat. The mills are slower. The ovens are cooler. The markets echo. One day, a minor riot did break out near the Forum Boreum, the old cattle market. A rumor spread that a new grain shipment had finally arrived. Hundreds flocked to the docks, only to find a single small ship carrying spoiled millet. Fights broke out. The magistrate was pelted with fruit. But by sunset, the crowd had melted again into silence. The hunger didn't spark revolution, it sparked something subtler: migration. Families left the city, drifting toward the countryside, toward smaller towns. A trickle of abandonment. No declarations, just empty doorways, quiet evacuations. Rome was being abandoned, not in panic, but in boredom, in fatigue. It's said that by the time winter deepened, nearly 40,000 more had left the city. No one really noticed at first, and still, no one knew what happened to the ship. Did it sink, unrecorded, beneath the quiet Mediterranean fog? Was it raided by vandals off the coast of Mauritania? Was it never launched, left rotting at dock because some corrupt officials sold the cargo to the highest bidder? Whatever the truth, one ship just, one left a wound. A wound not just of hunger, but of trust. If the empire could not deliver bread to its own capital, what else had it lost? And so we return to that moment, a grain ship that never arrived, and an empire that, despite all its legions, its temples, and laws, could not explain its absence. But here's the question no one asked at the time. What if the ship had arrived? Would it have changed anything at all? Asterisk, by the early months of 384 CE, the silence surrounding the missing grain shipment had become deafening. Not a day passed without someone asking where the ship had gone. And yet, the question wasn't asked in the forum anymore. It was asked in alleyways, in shared tenement stairwells, in whispered prayers at the altars of neglected gods. At first, city administrators clung to routine. The bureaucracy of Rome had been finely tuned over centuries, oiled by scribes, sustained by habit. Dockets were filed, seals were stamped. Couriers delivered scrolls to regional governors and port officials along the African coast. Some letters returned. Most did not. The notaries at the prefectus, unknown, the office in charge of Rome's food supply, adjusted their ledgers like a potter trying to reshape cracked clay. They shaved figures here, stretched inventories there, and hoped no one would question the arithmetic too closely. But people did notice, especially the women in Rome. It was often women, mothers, grandmothers, daughters, who stood in the grain queues, who bartered in the market, who broke and soaked a stale bread to feed a child or a sick elder. Wears a different mask when it's your job to keep others from starving. And in the city's insolent apartment blocks, that housed most of the population, the signs were visible. Cooking smells faded. Meals grew quieter. Neighbors shared less. There was no official famine declared. No grand edict of emergency. Rome was too proud, too practiced in the art of denial. But merchants began hoarding grain. Bakers demanded prepayment. The price of oil and dried fish rose in tandem with the whispers of discontent. An old inscription outside the temple of Ceres read, "Panem et securitate." Get bread and securitate. But the letters had faded. And now both promises rang hollow. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the situation was murky. The once reliable granaries of Byzantine and Zujatana were under new pressures. Tax burdens had increased. Landowners were storing grain locally in fear of rebellion or weather uncertainty. Corruption was not uncommon. Local officials were known to skim off the top of shipments, exaggerate yields, or delay transfers for bribes. Some suspected that the missing grain ship had never been missing at all, that it had simply been sold off, repurposed, or redirected to some governor's personal stockpile. Rome, once the heart of empire, had become just one of many mouths to feed. And then there was the sea. The Mediterranean, known as Mare Nostrum, had grown less secure. Pirates not, the romantic kind, the desperate men in patched sails and borrowed swords, roamed the sea lanes between Sicily and Africa. Many were former soldiers, dismissed from the army during budget cuts, now surviving by intercepting cargo. Vessels, grain, soft and light, traveled in bulk and fetched high prices in black markets. By spring, the city's mood had congealed into a kind of numbness. People weren't shouting in the streets anymore. They were folding inwards, eating less, saying less, trusting less. A letter survives from a clerk named Aurelius Balbus, addressed to his brother in Capua. In it, he writes, "It is a strange thing, brother, how hunger slows the mind. I find myself rereading old laws with a kind of comfort, as though they could still protect us, but the bread is dry, and so is the justice." The Senate, largely ceremonial by this time, debated the issue once briefly. A motion was proposed to levy emergency grain from the estates in Etruria. It was blocked by landowning senators who argued with practiced detachment that such a move would damage the delicate balance between Rome and its regional grain partners. Another motion suggested sending emissaries to the African provinces to investigate, but the funding was never approved. Instead, smaller gestures were made. The state funded public meals for orphans. A shrine to Annona, the goddess of grain supply, was cleaned and rededicated. A statue of Ceres was paraded through the streets. But these were rituals, without rations hope, without calories. And so, the city waited. The worst impact was not among the poorest. Strangely, they had always lived close to the edge. They adapted. Was the lower middle classes, the tradesmen, scribes, former soldiers. Acute, sir squeeze, felt the squeeze most acutely. Cute, they had enough memory of better meals to feel the loss as a betrayal. They had enough pride to avoid begging, but not enough wealth to insulate themselves. Their decline was quiet and invisible, like rot beneath stone. In the Trastevere district, where dock workers and artisans lived, theft rose slightly. Not high-profile crime. Small, desperate acts. A pot of beans stolen. A basket of spoiled figs lifted. A millstone sabotaged. Every crime was a tiny statement. This is not working anymore. One woman, Lucia Prisca, who kept a small stall selling flatbread and olives, was found dead in her stall one morning. Not murdered. Collapsed from exhaustion, malnutrition, and likely infection. Her neighbors covered her with their own shawl and quietly closed her stall. No officials came. Her name appears in no census. What's striking is that there was no hero in this story, no strong leader stepping in to command fleets, reorganize supplies, or rallied the public. Rome had become a city of managers, not saviors. Administrators were skilled at delaying panic, not preventing it. The empire, at this point, functioned more like a habit than a vision, and still, no one found a ship. Some said it had sunk quietly off the coast of Sardinia. Others said it never left port. Some even said it was a ghost story and excuse fabricated by corrupt officials to cover up the sale of grain to rival cities. The ship became a symbol, not of disaster, but of indifference. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing only a few years earlier, had warned, "Rome is not falling from fire, but from forgetting." He was half right. The fall would come not from forgetting alone, but from hunger ignored, logistics postponed, and truths avoided. That year, the harvests in Campania were modest but passable. Yet much of that grain never reached the capital. It was kept for local armies, or taxed and rerouted. Rome's priority status had quietly been downgraded. Without anyone announcing it, the Eternal City had become just another city. The census that year recorded fewer citizens in Rome than in previous decades, but no one really trusted the numbers. Many births went unrecorded. Many deaths were unnamed. The city was not dying in fire, or siege it was dissolving, like chalk and water-topped people. Adjusted. Some grew their own barley on rooftops. Others formed neighborhood cooperatives, sharing small gardens behind temples. But such efforts were meager, symbolic. They could not replace what the state had once provided. And through all of this, there remained that singular, haunting question whispered in wine shops and under colonnades. If one ship could break the city, how many others had already vanished without notice? Asterisk, by the autumn of 384 CE, the people of Rome had grown used to waiting. They waited in lines, in courtyards, in silence. I waited without expectation. The promise of food, once a guarantee of imperial strength, had quietly collapsed into a question no one dared to voice aloud. The ship, of course, never came. In a way, it didn't need to. The damage had already been done, not by its absence, but by the way that absence was handled. Rome could have endured another famine. It had done so before. Crops had failed. Fires had swept through storehouses. Riots had broken out. What made this time different was the quiet and institutional, suffocating quiet. No official explanation ever arrived. No plaque marked the delay. No senator gave a name to the failure. Instead, the empire offered nothing, and this silence was the first real betrayal. Historian Eutropius, writing some years later in a tone noticeably duller than his earlier work, noted, the people of Rome began to speak of the empire as if it were a neighbor they once trusted, who now passed them in the street without a glance. Trust had always been the true currency of empire, not gold, not laws. Trust that the roads would hold, that water would flow, that grain would arrive, that someone, somewhere, still cared about the people in the heart of the capital. Now, even that thread had snapped. What's remarkable is that there was no rebellion, no torchlit marches or bloody coups, just a slow, exhaler shrug of a city realizing it had been quietly demoted in the grand hierarchy of imperial importance. That winter, snowfall came early. The rooftops of Rome gathered their white dust, and the Tiber ran slower, colder. Okay. With no surplus grain to dry and store, many ovens remained dark. Fires burned low to conserve fuel. The bakeries, once full of shouting and heat, now sounded like mausoleums. A temple official named Quintus Servius began lighting votive candles, not for the gods, but for the memory of routine. He wrote in his account books, "Today I lit a candle for the seventh day without fresh bread. Tomorrow I will light." 2. Such quiet ceremonies became common. Rituals detached from religion, rooted instead in mourning the collapse of simple habits. The empire had not fallen, not in the dramatic way that future historians might prefer. It had withdrawn, a little each day, little more each season. In private chambers, behind thick walls, the senators whispered about reallocation, about reducing Rome's grain allotments permanently, about shifting resources east, where Constantinople now shone like a newer, sleeker twin. Some agreed, some protested, but none could deny the logic. Rome was too costly, too bloated, too brittle. One senator, Marcius Rufinus, proposed that the city's population be encouraged to disperse voluntarily to outer provinces, where land and food were more stable. Hayes' suggestion was tabled without vote, but not rejected. That too was telling. In the outer districts, signs of decay were harder to ignore. Aqueducts still ran, but with more frequent interruptions. Public latrines grew filthier. The bathhouses, once a symbol of civic pride, began to close early or altogether. And in the cracks of Rome's infrastructure, nature returned feral dogs nesting in abandoned grain depots, weeds sprouting through stone. People adapted in small ways. They learned to reuse cooking water, to barter instead of coin, to speak less and only when necessary. But the strangest development of that winter was psychological. A mood shift so subtle that even the poets of the time barely noticed it. Until then, hunger had always been something to fear, to resist. But now, hunger became normal. It lost its edge. It was no longer a warning sign of collapse, but part of the landscape, like cold mornings or dusty mosaics. People began to forget the sensation of being full. Children born that year did not know what bread was supposed to taste like, and with this new normal came something even stranger: indifference. When a young magistrate was caught hoarding flour in a private cellar, no mobs gathered, no punishments were demanded. People muttered and moved on. They expected betrayal now, and that, more than anything, was the empire's final act, teaching its citizens not to care. In early 385, a fleet of modest grain shipments finally did arrive, not from Africa, but from Sicily and Sardinia, hastily gathered, barely enough to scrape by. The arrival caused a brief stir. Bread was distributed in smaller portions than ever before, but people accepted it with quiet faces and shallow gratitude. There was no celebration, no ceremony. The ship that had vanished the year before was never mentioned again. It became a ghost in the city's memory. Not mourned, not blamed, folded into the layers of disappointment that had, by then, become Rome's new architecture. Few years later, when the Visigoths would eventually sack the city in 410, many would point to that moment as a shock, a catastrophe. But those who lived through the famine of 384 knew better. Rome had already been sacked, quietly, internally, not by sword or fire, but by administrative drift, by hunger ignored, and by the day the empire stopped explaining itself. One letter, found scratched into a wall of a grain warehouse, later converted into a shelter, simply reads, "We waited. The ship never came. We stayed anyway." That's the legacy of the famine. Not flames, not revolution, just people staying anyway. Asterisk. Salt is such a small thing. Pinch of it disappears into soup, vanishes on the tongue. Leaves behind only a sensational reminder of presence, more than the presence itself. But in the Byzantine Empire, around the 11th century, salt was no afterthought. It was a keystone, invisible hinge upon which markets, armies, and lives turned. And when it began to disappear slowly, quietly not, with a bang, but with a dill inked on paper behind shaded doors, the empire didn't just lose its flavor. It lost a part of its control. This is the story of how the Eastern Roman Empire, the proud remnant of Roman glory, began unraveling through one of its most overlooked trade concessions: salt. You can picture Constantinople then not at its height. But before the long slope down, the domes still caught the morning light. Hagia Sophia still echoed with whispers and sandals and incense. The harbor teemed with ships. The city glowed with glass and gold, but beneath that shimmer was a tension like pulled thread. The empire was overextended. Its troops needed funding. Its bureaucrats needed paying. Forts along the eastern frontier had begun to crumble. Tax revolts sparked like dry brush in Anatolia. And always, the treasury was shrinking, and so the court of Emperor Constantine IX, in a palace shaded by poplar trees and guarded by eunuchs with silken sleeves, made a deal in the year 1045. In a gesture that seemed trivial to the public, the empire ceded control of its salt trade in the Adriatic to the Republic of Venice. Venice, nimble, hungry, rich in ships, but poor in land, had been courting the empire for years. Its merchants offered naval support, tariffs, access to Western markets in exchange for one thing: monopoly rights on salt. The agreement looked harmless at first. Venice would be allowed to manage a handful of salt pans along the Dalmatian coast. In return, the Venetians promised discounted grain shipments and military aid, but buried in the terms were privileges far more dangerous: exemptions from Byzantine tolls, freedom from inspection, and unrestricted trade in key cities. And so, with the signature, the empire's salt slowly began to change hands. Why does this matter? Because salt wasn't just seasoning. It preserved meat in an age without refrigeration. It was used to tan hides, to pickle vegetables, to clean wounds, to cure fish for armies marching far inland. Salt was how the empire fed itself when seasons failed. It was how it kept soldiers moving and cities fed. It was currency, power, and leverage. And now, that leverage belonged to someone else. At first, no one noticed. The market still bustled. The salt still came. The Venetian traders, always smiling and silent, kept things running smoothly. In fact, the price of salt even dropped for a while. It seemed like a win, but slowly the shift became visible in strange places. Fishmongers in Thessalonica began complaining that the salt they received spoiled faster. Salt blocks, once sourced from imperial warehouses, were replaced with rough, inferior imports. Military quartermasters wrote to Constantinople that salted pork wasn't lasting on campaign routes. Troops fell ill with stomach cramps and bloating minor symptoms, ignored by generals, but felt by every man marching under the imperial eagle. And then the prices began to rise. Venetian control meant Venetian discretion. By the 1060s, salt cost nearly double what it had a generation before. Byzantium could no longer dictate terms. It had to pay what the merchants demanded. And since the state had grown reliant on imported salt, it had no real alternative. The loss of salt was like a crack in a dam's maul at first, then growing. The city of Adrianople recorded an outbreak of foodborne illness in 1064, traced to improperly preserved fish. In Smyrna, a merchant fleet returned with barrels of spoiled olives, ruined for lack of quality brining. In the border towns of eastern Anatolia, where troops relied on preserved supplies from the interior, complaints turned to mutiny. One garrison near the fortress of Ani refused orders after being issued foul-smelling rations. The commander was stoned in his own tent. No one was punished, and yet the imperial court barely reacted. There were bigger problems. They said Norman invasions in Italy, unrest in Armenia, Seljuk raids in the east. The salt crisis was never declared a crisis. It was just absorbed, accepted. Absorbed like a damp wall accepts moisture quietly until it crumbles. What is most haunting about this episode is how bloodless it was. There was no war, no siege, no grand betrayal, just a contract. Just a shift of supply chains. And Byzantiums, so proud, so ancient, so sure of its destiny, began paying someone else for the very thing it once exported. A merchant named Delasios, who kept records in the city of Dyrrhachium, wrote a single sentence in his ledgers: "The year Venice doubled its salt prices, they sell back to us what we once gave away." His handwriting shakes slightly on the page. What does it mean when an empire stops supplying itself? When it forgets how to salt its own food? It means control has passed not in the streets, not on the battlefield, but in the gut. And perhaps the most unnerving question of all, the one no scribe or senator dared ask out loud: was this what other quiet necessities were being traded away without anyone noticing? Asterisk, by the late 1060s, the effects of the salt concession began to steep like brine itself, subtle at first, but saturating every layer of the Byzantine system. It wasn't about the salt anymore, it was about what salt represented. The empire's slow trade of self-sufficiency for convenience, power for dependency, legacy for short-term deals. In Constantinople's bustling markets, the changes were spoken of in ordinary terms. Housewives at the stalls complained about the smell of their pickled garlic or the strange sheen of dried meats. Bakers noticed that salted butter spoiled faster. Even perfumers whispered that their salves no longer lasted as long in the summer heat. Salt, the unseen backbone of preservation, was failing them. But it didn't fail because it was missing. It failed because it was now managed by those who profited most when it failed. The Republic of Venice, small, nimble, and ruthlessly pragmatic, realized something long before Constantinople did, that it didn't need to conquer Byzantium to control it. It only needed to feed it. And once Venice controlled the salt pans in Dalmatia, it didn't stop there. More agreements followed: exclusive trade in other goods, legal immunity in key port cities, the right to build quarters within Constantinople, itself known as the Venetian quarter, where their merchants operated under their own laws, flying their own banners, using their own coin. To the average citizen, these changes felt distant, but for the state, it meant fewer taxes collected, less control. The empire's arteries had been tap-tanned. They were bleeding slowly. Military provisioning began to suffer. Salted rations were crucial for armies on campaign. Without them, food spoiled within days. Soldiers weakened. Armies slowed. Historians often point to the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 as a turning point for Byzantium. And while the battle itself was a disaster, less is said about the years leading up to it, the long attrition, not just of troops and trust, but of logistics. Some chroniclers mention food sickness in the eastern regiments prior to the battle. One letter, attributed to a field physician named Nicetas of Melitene, noted that half the dried beef smelled of copper and death, and that salt cakes crumpled into a tasteless dust. It seems minor, but when you're fighting an enemy terrain, preservation is survival. The state tried to adjust. Officials considered reopening old salt mines in the interior. A few were reactivated, especially near Chalcis and Nicomedia, but centuries of neglect had taken their toll. The infrastructure was gone, the labor force untrained. The salt was coarse, low in quality, poorly stored, and worse, Venetian trade deals had priority clauses. Any salt mine within the empire had to be offered to Venetian merchants, first at discounted rates. In effect, Byzantium could not even reclaim its own salt without paying for it twice, once in concessions, and again in lost autonomy. And with every year, the Venetian grip grew tighter. By 1080, it was estimated that over 70% of salt traded in the empire's western territories passed through Venetian hands. In cities like Thessalonica, Trebizond, and even in distant Antioch, local merchants began pricing their goods not in solidus or copper fallis, but in Venetian ducats. Its creeping monetization of the empire's daily life was not just economic, it was cultural, it was political. The identity of Byzantium was being seasoned, slowly and invisibly, with foreign control. Some at court noticed. Isaac Komnenos, brother of the future emperor Alexios, wrote in his private diaries, "We have sold our roof tiles one by one to pay for oil, and now the rain is in our soup." Salt is just the beginning, but Isaac was ignored. Others saw Venice, not as a parasite, but as a partner. They built statues of St. Mark in seaside towns. They wore Venetian silks, drank Venetian wine. They saw the Merchant Republic as protection against Norman raids, against Islamic expansion, even against internal dissent. Venice was a shield, they said. They forgot that a shield, when held too long, becomes a burden. What was most tragic and most telling was that the public didn't resist. There were no salt riots, no angry mobs tearing down customs houses. The people of the empire adapted, as people always do, diluted their brine. They learned to eat more fresh food, or less food. They bought herbs to mask the spoilage. Some turned to vinegar, others to smoke. Few moved to rural areas, closer to natural salt deposits. It was the usual quiet resilience. But not all suffered equally. The aristocracy had private cellars stocked with imported Venetian salt, clean and white. The monastic orders, especially those aligned with Venice, were granted discounts in exchange for loyalty. Large landowners in Thrace paid off officials to gain early access to salt shipments. But the poor, the laborers, the washerwomen, the conscripts faced shortages, rising costs, and the risk of spoilage in nearly every meal. One woman, a widow named Thamar, left behind a brief note in a probate inventory from 1083. She listed, among her possessions, 1 cracked basin, 2 linen sheets, 1 jar of honey, a single block of salt, wrapped in wax and hidden from neighbors. That a widow would conceal her salt from her neighbors speaks volumes. Salt had become not just commodity, but survival, a thing worth hiding, worth lying about, and the state's silence was deafening. Byzantine emperors in this era, especially Nicaros III, and later Alexios I, faced overwhelming external threats. Turks in the east, Normans in the west, internal rebellion. They had little bandwidth for trade policy, much less salt reform. So the Venetian treaties stood, renewed, expanded, deepened. There was a moment, briefly, in 1089, when an envoy proposed a renegotiation, a tax increase on Venetian goods, a cap on their salt prices. But the Venetians threatened to withdraw naval support in the Adriatic. Facing piracy, famine, and war, the empire blinked, and that was it. By then, the empire had grown used to the taste of someone else's salt. And so, beneath the domes and golden mosaics, an empire that once salted the world now bought its own. Survival in foreign sacks. No revolt, no rebellion. Just silence, which leaves us with one final question. If an empire can no longer preserve its food, can it preserve itself? By the early 1090s, the Venetian quarter inside Constantinople no longer felt like part of the Byzantine Empire. It was a small city within a city, lined with warehouses, taverns, chapels, and homes that answered not to the emperor, but to the Doge of Venice. Venetian flags flew quietly over dockside buildings. Venetian guards, armed not with spears, but with contracts, patrolled the customs gates. Their laws were their own. Terror, language, filled the air. And salt, though only one of the goods moving in and out, remained the silent foundation. Beneath it all, salt had become a quiet border. It had marked where the empire's control stopped, not on a map, but in a market. The imperial court, by now hardened by decades of war and collapse, treated the Venetian presence with a kind of exhausted pragmatism. Let them have their salt, one counselor reportedly muttered, as long as they hold the sea. But the consequences of that salt, of seeding it, of depending on it, were showing their wear. Byzantine merchants had been priced out of their own trade routes. Fishermen along the Aegean coast could no longer afford to preserve their catch. Smugglers appeared in increasing numbers, offering low-quality, heavily adulterated salt from Egypt and even as far as the Black Sea. In the rural provinces, salt had become both a luxury and a bribe, something handed discreetly to tax collectors or local priests. One scholar in the monastery of Studios, a quiet man named Petros Makrinos, copied religious texts by day and observed economic patterns by night. In the margin of a manuscript dated 1094, he wrote this simple line: "Salt is no longer part of the earth. It now arrives by ship, wrapped in terms we did not write." The erosion of sovereignty had become personal, and it was not just economic. The shift seeped into Byzantine identity. The empire, once proud of its bureaucratic brilliance, its administrative complexity, its ability to feed and rule distant provinces, now relied on another power for one of the simplest, oldest needs known to man. In public festivals, the old rituals continued. Bread was blessed, salt was shared, but the symbolism had hollowed. The empire performed strength without owning it. It gestured toward abundance while buying it at market rates. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who came to power in 1081 and ruled with a sharp eye and heavy burdens, knew the cost of these arrangements. In his personal correspondence with the papacy and with the Venetians themselves, he tried repeatedly to assert a measure of control. But he was too dependent. The empire's fleet was weak, the treasury thinner still, and Venice knew it. 1. Letter from Alexios to the Doge in 1096. Pleads for adjusted tariffs and salt supply prioritization for imperial troops. The Doge replies with polite concern and no firm promises. Instead, he sends a gift, 20 barrels of the finest Dalmatian salt, hand-packed and sealed with the line of St. Mark. It was a gift shaped like a collar. The same year, the First Crusade passed through Byzantine lands, hungry, ill-disciplined, and suspicious of the empire's intentions. The Crusaders disrupted trade and provoked panic in Constantinople. Alexios, always a diplomat, directed resources toward guiding the Crusaders east across the Bosporus and away from the city. But even in these chaotic moments, the Venetians remained untouched. Their quarter was protected. Their ships continued to dock, unload, reload, and sail. While the empire braced for western nights and eastern invasions, the Venetians salted their cargo and counted their coin. There were no uprisings against the Venetian presence, but resentment fermented. That resentment would one day erupt in this century, not even in the next, but in 1204, when Constantinople would fall not to Muslim armies, but to Latin crusaders, and Venetian ships would guide them to the Ta walls. But that was still over a century away. For now, the salt crisis was not a firestorm. It was something softer, slower, a quiet recalibration of who owned what. In 1099, a small community of Byzantine salt workers in Nicomedia submitted a petition. They requested state funding to reopen 3 dormant salt pans and train new workers. Their request was noted, then shelved, then forgotten. The salt pans remained dry. The salt kept arriving by sea, and the empire, once so proud of its civil service, of its ability to count and categorize the world, had no answer. It no longer remembered how to be salty on its own. In some forgotten corner of the city down by the docks, where foreign ships came and went, the child once asked his father why their salt had a lion stamped into it. The father said nothing. He just looked out to sea. Asterisk. At the end of the 15th century, the smell of Europe was changing. Centuries of meat-heavy winters and sour bread gave way to something else, aromas of nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, and most importantly, pepper. Black pepper, that tiny, wrinkled berry from the Malabar coast, became the most sought-after item in European kitchens, apothecaries, and courts. And for a short while, a very short while. It belonged almost entirely to one empire, Portugal, from the wind-swept Atlantic harbors of Lisbon to the humid docks of Goa. Portugal held what others could only taste. It wasn't conquest in the traditional sense. It was a monopoly, a stranglehold on something no one wanted to admit they depended on. But pepper, like empires, does not like to be held for long. The story begins not with war, but with wind. In 1498, Vasco da Gama navigated around the Cape of Good Hope, following winds unknown to most European sailors. He reached Calicut on India's southwestern coast, and there, amid palms and carved temples, he found pepper. Not heaps of it in bowls, not luxury samples, but warehouses, markets, piles of it. The way one might see sacks of grain in Seville or Florence. At the time, pepper was not new to Europe. It had traveled through the Arab world, through Venice, through Alexandria, but it had been expensive, controlled, filtered. Portugal wanted to cut out every middleman to touch the source, so they did, with cannons. Vasco da Gama's voyage marked not a discovery, but a redirection. Portugal didn't build an empire by settling India. It built one by redirecting the flow of pepper. And, for a while, it worked. Between 1500 and 1550, Portugal grew drunk on pepper profits. Forts were built along the Indian coast, Cochin, Goa, Cannon, or little walled edges of Europe in a tropical world. The Portuguese crown taxed every shipment. Armadas escorted cargo through the Indian Ocean. Lisbon filled with coin. In Europe, paid. Pepper became more than seasoning. It became proof of status, a display of wealth. It flavored the tables of German dukes and Spanish counts. It entered contracts and dowries. Some historians joke that, in certain courts, pepper was worth its weight in gold, except it wasn't a joke. For a brief time, it truly was. But pepper doesn't stay put, and neither do monopolies. Asterix, Portugal's pepper monopoly was always fragile, built on violence, small garrisons, and long supply chains. And in those quiet corners between forts and fleets, cracks began to form. By the 1560s, several things had started to go wrong. The Portuguese administration in Goa grew bloated and corrupt. Soldiers stationed in India often went unpaid for months. Local traders, once cooperative, began to grow resentful. The Portuguese demanded fixed prices. They forbade native merchants from trading directly with Arab, Malay, or Indian Ocean partners, so the locals adapted. Pepper was smuggled inland, moved at night. Porters carried it in hollowed logs, under baskets of fish, even in funeral processions. When an empire tries to control a product too tightly, people stop following rules. They start inventing routes and across the Arabian Sea. Others were watching. The Dutch. Asterisk. The Dutch Republic, newly rich from textile and shipping ventures, was not satisfied with waiting for Portuguese pepper at inflated prices. They sent their own ships, cautiously learning the winds, the routes, the languages. Then, aggressively, by 1595, Dutch ships had begun to intercept Portuguese convoys. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company (VOC) was formed not just as a trading group, but as a state-backed corporate empire. It soldiers, ships, the right to wage war. They didn't attack Lisbon. They didn't need to. They went straight to the source. By the early 1600s, Dutch ships were landing in Java and Sumatra, offering better deals to local pepper growers. They paid in silver, didn't demand religious conversion, and came with fewer guns, at least at first. Villages that once sold to Portuguese factors began shifting allegiance, and back in Portugal, the signs were subtle, but real. The pepper shipments arrived later. The sacks were smaller. The profit margins dipped to the traders, whispered. The king ignored it. It wasn't until 1620 that a Portuguese merchant named Antonio Vieira wrote to the royal court with a direct warning. We are not losing battles, we are losing merchants. The pepper that once sweetened our ledgers is now flavoring Dutch treaties. He was ignored. By then, the Portuguese Empire was distracted, dynastic disputes, a union with Spain, financial collapse. The pepper that had once poured into Europe under red and green banners was now arriving in barrels stamped with the Dutch lion. But the most painful part, the Portuguese still thought they were in control. The contracts still said. So the forts still flew flags, but the pepper wasn't stopping for them anymore. It flowed around them through new routes, new hands, new promises, and Lisbon began to taste something it hadn't known in a century. Loss, which raises a question that the empire never asked, till it was too late. What happens when your wealth sails away? You don't even see the sails. Asterisk, the first thing to go was the silence. Whispers filled Spain's docks, merchants complaining that the spice ships arrived half empty, that profits were lower than last year, that Indian ports were growing colder to Portuguese deals. But the royal court, still cloaked in the golden illusion of monopoly, dismissed these murmurs as noise from impatient men, and yet the records told a different story. The Casa da India, the Portuguese state trading office, kept detailed ledgers. They were dry, careful, precise lists of barrels, ships, and returns. These entries, once bursting with the confidence of double margins, now began to show inconsistencies. Entire shiploads were underweight. Delivery times stretched into weeks, then months. Shipmasters reported trouble in Cochin. Officials in Goa spoke of merchants disappearing inland, of prices doubling at source, of long familiar villages refusing to sell. But the most damaging news came not from Asia. It came from Amsterdam. Dutch merchants, leaner, faster, more financially agile, were selling pepper at nearly half the price of Lisbon. And they weren't just selling in the Netherlands. They were undercutting the Portuguese in Hamburg, Antwerp, Paris, even Seville. The web of trade Portugal had spun over a century was being eaten strand by strand from the outside and inside. The K had already taken root. The forts on the Malabar coast had once stood proud, perched above the waves with their cannon mouths aimed westward. But by the 1630s, many were rotting from within. The garrisons were underpaid and undermanned. Supplies ran late. Local populations, once cooperative, were openly hostile. Smugglers passed within sight of Portuguese watchtowers, often bribing guards with just a few silver coins or ironically small sacks of pepper. In Goa, the viceroyal palace had grown quiet. Courtiers came and went with tired faces. The once bustling streets of the administrative capital now echoed with disputes over missing cargo, bad deals, and failed negotiations. One clerk named in the records, but likely a minor official, in the saltpeter office wrote in a private margin, "We do not govern the trade now. We plead with it." Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, the Dutch strategy deepened. They didn't try to control India all at once. Instead, they targeted choke points, strategic ports like Pulakat, the pepper-rich Banda Islands, and eventually Malacca. They used a different approach. Fewer missionaries, fewer edicts, and more contracts. They paid better. They stayed out of village rituals, and when they did use force, it was surgical. By the time Portuguese traders arrived at a pepper-growing region in 1635, they often found the best crops already spoken for Dutch coins in the hands of chiefs. VOC ships loading quietly at night. But the real heartbreak wasn't just about business. It was about identity. Portugal had built a national myth around its pepper dominance. Children in Lisbon learned about Vasco da Gama the way others learned about saints. Paintings of caravels cutting through spice-laden waters hung in churches. Pepper wasn't just a good, it was a symbol, justification for empire. And now, it was slipping away without war, without invasion. without even much noise. One Portuguese merchant in Goa, João Nunes de Andrade, wrote to his brother in Porto, "The Dutch do not shout, K-sign, they smile. And by the time we've finished praying, they've already bought the next season." In desperation, the Portuguese tried to retaliate. They raised taxes on native pepper merchants. They sent military patrols to block smugglers. They imposed forced labor in some regions to shore up the plantations. But this only worsened the situation. Rebellions flared. The Quillan Uprising of 1640, largely ignored by European historians, was, at heart, a fight over pepper rights. Villagers torched warehouses, blocked roads, and killed Portuguese tax agents. In retaliation, Portuguese soldiers burned several pepper groves and hung alleged rebels in public squares. It wasn't just a policy failure, it was a relationship failure. The pepper that had once flowed toward Portuguese ships by mutual interest was now being seized, strained, and spoiled. And then the weather turned in 1643. An unusually wet season caused large portions of the Malabar pepper crop to rot on the vine. Portuguese buyers, strapped for funds and lacking local goodwill, missed critical harvests. Dutch traders, with their deeper pockets and more responsive networks, swept in and bought what remained. That year, Portuguese spice exports fell to their lowest level since 1510. The Casa da India responded by revising its ledgers, removing data, hiding losses. But inside the royal palace, the truth was already known. King João IV, restored to the Portuguese throne after the end of the Iberian Union with Spain, inherited not an empire of riches, but one of illusions. One of his advisors, Duarte da Silveira, reportedly said, "We have traded our discovery for a receipt. We used to sell pepper. Now we borrow it." Still, the courts prayed for a revival. They organized festivals, gilded the churches, sent another flotilla, but the numbers kept falling. The contracts kept failing. In Lisbon's great pepper warehouses, they stood half empty, dust collecting where spice had once settled in fragrant layers. Which leaves us with a deeper question, one even more painful than loss. What happens when a nation builds its pride on something it cannot control, and then forgets how to lose with grace? Asterisk, by the middle of the 17th century, the Portuguese grip on the pepper trade had dissolved almost entirely, though few in Lisbon were willing to say so out loud. They still told the old stories. Children recited Vasco da Gama's landfall in Calicut with reverence. Painters still depicted ships bursting with spices, carved prow cutting through blue-gold seas, a banner snapping overhead in the royal courts and cathedral halls. The myth of a pepper-rich empire still held sway, but in the ledgers, reality was quieter, duller, brutal. Pepper shipments arrived sporadically now, small and overpriced. The state had gone from distributor to debtor. Where once Portuguese fleets left Goa loaded with sacks of pepper for Europe, they now waited, often empty, until merchants found someone willing to sell. And when they did sell, it was no longer to Portugal alone. The Dutch had absorbed the rhythm of the sea. Their ships moved more freely. Their terms were clearer, and their interests sharpened by profit, not pride cut deeper. The Portuguese tried to hold on in 1645. A new agreement was made with a small princely state near Cochin. It guaranteed pepper at fixed prices for 10 years. But within 2 seasons, the prince broke the contract, lured away by a Dutch deal 3 times higher. The Portuguese threatened retaliation. The prince simply shrugged. What could they do? By now, even the Portuguese in India had grown weary of Lisbon's directives. Colonial administrators, underpaid and overworked, began trading with the Dutch themselves. Quietly, privately, illegally, pepper flowed into Portuguese warehouses one day, and out through the back doors the next, loaded into Dutch skiffs with no flag. By 1650, the term pepper fleet in Lisbon had become bitter irony. The crown attempted reforms, new taxes, new appointments, reshuffling of the Casa da India, but the world had moved on. The empire was bloated, mismanaged, and misled. The coffers were drained not just by trade losses, but by war with Spain, uprisings in Brazil, unrest in Angola. Portugal had built its identity around long-distance trade, but it had failed to evolve with the world and help reshape back in Europe. Merchants began referring to Dutch pepper as fresh and Portuguese pepper as old stock. In Frankfurt, in Vienna, in Lyon, buyers preferred the steady supply and transparent pricing of the Dutch, even when Portuguese pepper was available. It carried a certain stain associated with delay, with spoilage, with the scent of decline. An archive from Antwerp dated 1653 includes a list of cancelled Portuguese spice orders. In the margin, one buyer scribbled, "Too late, too little, too proud." In Goa, the situation worsened. Rebellions flared again in the pepper-growing regions. Not for independence, but for trade. Farmers wanted fair prices. They wanted contracts that made sense. The Portuguese, under pressure, responded with force, raids, confiscations, arrests, and with every heavy-handed act, they lost more ground. More pepper flowed to the Dutch, to the English, even to the French. Meanwhile, Lisbon state ships often sailed half-empty, carrying only the weight of expectation. In 1663, the Dutch seized Cochin. It was symbolic more than strategic. The fort fell with little resistance. The Portuguese governor signed the surrender in silence. There was no grand battle, no martyrdom, just a quiet handover of Quizand. The final pepper route fell. That year, Lisbon received no major pepper shipment from India for the first time in over 150 years. No one announced it. No bells rang, but in the ledger rooms of the Casa da India, a clerk named Tomas Ferrero entered the number 0 beside the spice entry. Then he underlined it. Then he closed the book. He would be the last clerk to do so in that column. Portugal still had colonies, still had wealth, still had sugar and gold and ships. But its Celeste myth had been wrapped in pepper, and the pepper was gone, not burned, not stolen, just redirected, which may be the most painful way to lose an empire, not in war or fire, but in the humdrum bureaucratic failure to keep up with the world it once helped create. Even today, historians argue whether the loss of the pepper monopoly marked the true decline of Portuguese global dominance. Some point to treaties, some to wars, to shifting tides. But one could also argue that it ended on paper that day, in that ledger, with that quiet little 0, because sometimes a single 0 is heavier than an entire fleet. Asterisk, it is 1985 in Moscow. The snow has turned to slush. The morning air smells of petrol and damp wool, and the line outside the shop wraps twice around the block. There is no sign above the store, just a faded placard and the smell of boiled cabbage leaking from a nearby apartment. No one knows exactly what will be sold today. It might be sugar, it might be soap. A rumor has gone around that it could be sausage, and so they wait. Dozens of people in heavy coats and shapeless scarves, leaning on their bags, watching their breath fog the air. Some have been standing since dawn. Others rotate with family members taking turns, one at a time, to keep their place. Children sit on crates, kicking their heels against the ice. Pensioners mutter about their war medals. Teenagers carve shapes into the frost on the shop window. This is not an unusual scene. This is the Soviet Union's most common and most devastating phenomena, the queue. From Riga to Vladivostok, from Leningrad to the edges of Central Asia, the line was where lives paused. It was where rumors spread, where friendships were forged and broken, where arguments ignited and died. It was also where the illusion of the Soviet promise began to crack, not from ideology, not from invasion, but from the slow, grinding erosion of the supply chain. The Soviet state had promised abundance. 5-year plans were printed with grand charts and heroic slogans. Propaganda posters showed women in headscarves, proudly harvesting wheat, smiling steelworkers, meat trucks rolling across endless plains. Our shelves will be full, they said. Our people will be fed. But inside the stores, reality whispered otherwise. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union, still the world's second superpower, could not reliably provide its citizens with toilet paper, fresh fruit, or even bread. And it wasn't a matter of national emergency. It was daily life. Economists call it systemic shortage, but the people just called it life. The problem wasn't that there was no food in the country. There was food, but it was misplaced, mismanaged, miscounted. A farm might grow cabbage, but the trucks wouldn't arrive. A factory might make soap, but the barrels to store it never came. A shipment of oranges might arrive in Murmansk, but without proper refrigeration, it would rot on the docks before reaching Minsk. And when something did reach the shelves, it vanished within minutes, which meant people learned to live in lines. They brought stools, samovars, decks of cards, reading material. Someone would hold your spot while you ran home to check the stove. Old women would keep lists, mentally recording who had cut in. Sometimes fights broke out. Other times, people shared bread or warmth. The queue became a second home, but more than that, became a mirror. It showed what the system could not fix in the official papers. The economy looked functional. Plans were met, targets reached. But the lines told another story, that the things people needed most, milk, butter, shoes, couldn't be planned into existence. They had to be made, moved, and sold with care. And care was something the system had lost. The year 1985 was especially tense. The leadership was aging. General Secretary Konstantin Chernyenko died that March. Mikhail Gorbachev took power days later. There was talk of reform, of glasnost and perestroika, but the shelves remained sparse. People still spent 3, 4, 5 hours a day waiting for necessities. One man, a school teacher named Andrei Petrov, kept a diary. March 22, 1985. I stood in line for eggs. 5 hours. When I reached the front, they were gone. The woman in front of me got the last dozen. She gave me 1 egg from her bag. I thanked her more sincerely than I've ever thanked a colleague. Its entry captures a truth the party never acknowledged, that generosity was rationed, just like everything else. There were tricks. Of course, some people had connections, as it was called. A cousin who worked in distribution, a friend in the bakery. These favors greased the system, A butcher would set aside a cut of meat. A store clerk would quietly phone a neighbor when the toilet paper arrived. But even Blatt couldn't erase the cues. It's only shifted who stood where. And so, a strange kind of faith developed, not in the system, but in the line. People believed in the line more than they believed in the state, because while the state lied, the line did not. It showed in real time what people needed, revealed scarcity in numbers you could count with your own eyes. When television said there was abundance, scores in your family spent 2 hours waiting. For milk, you believed the line. When the papers praised the meat harvest, but you queued 6 hours for a bone, you believed the line. The line became the most honest institution in the country, and slowly, that honesty unraveled the myth. At first, people only grumbled. Then they joked. A popular one. They pretend to pay us. We pretend to work, and we all pretend the line is moving. But the laughter was tired, which brings us to the heart of the question. Standing quietly under the gray sky, Can a system survive if its people believe the line, but not the leaders? Asterisk. The Soviet queue was not just a symptom. It became an institution, one not built with bricks and banners, but with human patience. And as the 1980s wore on, it was in these lines, more than in parliaments or party meetings, that the Soviet Union's unraveling quietly gained momentum. The average Soviet citizen spent several hours a week in a queue. For food, for shoes, for fabric, for kerosene, for toothpaste, for books. But the most telling aspect was this. No one knew exactly what would arrive or when. People stood in line first and asked questions later. Okay. If a line formed, others joined it on instinct. Something must be coming, they thought. It didn't matter what. Butter, oranges, batteries, children's socks. People stood. It was worth standing. This behavior wasn't foolish, strategic, because in the Soviet system, information about shortages was not just scarcity, was intentionally suppressed. Factory failures weren't reported. Transportation delays were classified. The newspapers would show full shelves in model cities, but never mentioned the days when those same shelves held only dust. So the line became the only signal left. It was human radar. Entire neighborhoods organized around it. Moscow's Yaroslavsky district. People took shifts babushkas in the morning, working men in the evening, teenagers on weekends. They kept notebooks of names and arrival times. They marked who cut the line. They tracked patterns, when the bread truck usually came, when the milk arrived, frozen solid, and the flour ran out. It was bureaucracy by necessity built, not by the state, but by its citizens, trying to survive the gap between what was promised and what could be touched. And in those long hours of standing, something else happened. People talked. At first, they grumbled about prices, about the new fabric that ripped after 2 washes, about the mystery meat in the state cafeteria. But as the shortages grew more absurd, so did the conversations. One woman in Kiev reportedly told a Western journalist in 1986, "At least during the war, we knew who the enemy was. Now we line up for cabbage, and no one can tell us why." Even loyal citizens began to falter. Party members who once stood at the front of official events now stood at the back of the bakery line. Red Army veterans, decorated with medals, waited like everyone else, sometimes for hours, for half a kilo of pork that never arrived. Their silence was telling, because in the Soviet Union, silence had always been a form of power. But now, in the line, silence was replaced by stories, and stories are dangerous. Anecdotes turned into patterns, rumors turned into truths. Someone heard about a woman in Novosibirsk who stood in line for 2 days and collapsed. Someone else heard that butter was being exported to Cuba while Russians ate margarine. Someone said a truck full of oranges was accidentally sent to Murmansk instead of Moscow, and the entire load froze solid before it could be redirected. These stories weren't always true, but they felt true. And in the Soviet Union of the late 1980s, what felt true became far more powerful than anything printed in Pravda. This erosion of belief was not sudden, it was daily, it was cumulative, and nowhere was it clearer than in the cities. In Leningrad, a mother named Alina Smirnova began writing down the products she couldn't find, day by day, in 1987. Her notebook survives. On its yellowed pages, she recorded, April 4th, no soap. April 5th, no diapers. April 6th, no eggs. April 7th, no matches, no tea. April 8th, bread after 4 p.m. only. Long queue. She continued this list for 4 months. On July 30th, she simply wrote, I feel I am documenting a country that no longer knows how to feed itself. That same summer, food riots broke out in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, not against capitalism, not against the West, but against the perceived competence of Moscow. They weren't chanting for freedom. They were chanting for flour. Meanwhile, in the capital, Gorbachev had begun reform periods, troika-comic restructuring, and glasnost toponis. But the changes came slowly, too slowly, and, in some cases, they made things worse. The loosening of price controls created chaos. The state wanted private markets to rise and replace the shortages, but without infrastructure or trust, nothing filled the gap. Stores emptied faster, prices soared, and the queues grew longer. People began sleeping outside stores, waiting for butter that might never arrive. They brought blankets, candles, radios. The lines were no longer interruptions. In life, they were life. One Soviet poet, Vasily Rozov, wrote in 1988, "We do not live in apartments, we live between one line and the next." The queue became more than a metaphor. It was an indictment, a quiet protest made visible every day, on every corner, in every province. The government still spoke of progress, still printed numbers, still held parades, but the people believed the line. So here, in the long, slushy lines of Soviet streets, we must pause and ask, if a government controls the factories, the farms, the press, and the courts, but not the line, what does it truly control? Asterisk. By 1989, the line was no longer just a place to wait. It had become a stage, where once people muttered under their breath. Now they spoke more openly about the party, about the ministries, about the numbers that no longer made sense. Each queue, long and winding, held its own rhythm, became a ritual of exposure, of witnessing, not just for what arrived in the delivery truck, but for what never did. The silence that had once characterized Soviet daily life, careful, guarded, obedient, was now broken daily by the act of standing still together, and people began to listen, not to the speeches broadcast from the Kremlin, but to each other. In cities across the USSR, Kiev, Tbilisi, Baku, Minsk lines for bread turned into forums. While legs ached and stomachs growled, minds stirred. The people shared survival tips, yes, but also stories of vanished sons, of doctors who had left for the West, of stores that received deliveries only for party insiders. One woman, a nurse from Novgorod, said in a televised interview, "We stand in line so long, we've learned each other's secrets, and now we know the country's secret to it doesn't work." It was not a rebellion, not yet, but it was a realization. Gorbachev's reforms had opened doors, but too many of those doors led to empty shelves. Glasnost allowed journalists to show reality, but that reality was already being lived by millions. There was no need to prove it. People could see it in the line, and the line, once a nuisance, had become proof. By the summer of 1989, newspapers began to print photographs that would have been banned only 5 years earlier, images of babushkas sitting on boxes outside a Leningrad bakery, children wrapped in blankets sleeping outside a meat shop, men holding signs with the word "no bread." The Soviet image of control, orderly, disciplined, predictable, was now publicly, visibly cracking, and behind them, images were stories of quiet breakdown in Omsk. A bakery reported that its daily flour shipment had been reduced by 60% due to a bottleneck at the regional granary. In Murmansk, a train carrying canned goods derailed because the rail ties hadn't been replaced in over a decade. In Tashkent, a produce warehouse lost 2/3 of its fruit because the refrigeration system, installed in 1963, had finally failed. No one had sabotaged these systems. They had simply been neglected, the same way the people had. The queues were not caused by one event, but by 1,000 unattended details. And now, those details were speaking. Even the party began to hear it. Internal reports to the Central Committee, once filled with optimistic phrasing, began to reflect the reality on the ground. Phrases like temporary supply fluctuations were replaced with widespread shortages. Targets were missed. Distribution collapsed. Central planning lost sight of what was actually happening at the local level. In a 1989 report from Sverdlovsk, a regional minister wrote, "We have enough bread in the region, but not in the right places, not at the right time, not in the right form. So our problem is not famine, it is paralysis." And then something shifted further. The line began to change shape. What had been a line for food became a line for other things: papers, protests. In August 1990, in Leningrad, over 10,000 people queued, not for sausage, but for signatures. They were signing a petition to reform the distribution of goods and, more importantly, to decentralize economic control. They weren't shouting. They weren't holding flags. They were standing in line, because that's what they knew how to do. And yet, this time, the line didn't end at a shop. It ended at an idea. Meanwhile, in the smaller towns and villages, things grew darker. Some towns received no deliveries for weeks. Italy residents bartered pickled mushrooms for soap. Men skipped work to stand for 2 hours for onions. Children ate bread with salt for dinner. Even vodka, a state-backed staple, became scarce. People lined up for it, just like everything else. When they couldn't find it, they made their own. Some went blind, others died. But more than anything, the line made people think. It made them calculate the absurdity of waiting for hours for cabbage. In the world's largest grain-producing nation, it made them wonder why a country with a space program couldn't supply women with sanitary pads, why a worker who built tanks in the Urals couldn't afford shoes for his daughter, and perhaps most dangerous of all, it made them imagine not standing in line in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Georgia. Nationalist movements began to grow. People gathered not only to chant for independence, but to share stories of long, meaningless waits. The shortages weren't just economic, okay? They were symbolic. In their minds, the queue was the Soviet Union. Slow, frustrating, unyielding. It didn't listen. It didn't bend, didn't care. And so they stopped believing in it. Not just in the line, but in the idea that it led anywhere at all. By late 1991, the queues had grown quiet again, not because the shops were full, but because they were abandoned. The shelves were still empty. But now, so was the regime that had once promised to fill them. And maybe, in the end, that's where the Soviet Union finally fell. Not at a border or in a battle, but in the slow, shuffling steps of people who stood in line long enough to see that they were being led nowhere. Asterisk, the Forbidden City, seat of emperors, jewel of dynasties, heart of the Middle Kingdom, was never supposed to burn. It was a place of perfect order, designed to reflect heaven itself, layer upon layer of courtyards, halls, and red lacquered gates aligned by cosmic principle, laid out according to the rules of divine geometry. The emperors lived behind walls of wood and stone, guarded by silence, symmetry, and superstition. But even palaces burn, and when they do, it is rarely in war. Sometimes it's just the kitchen. Asterisk. It was a winter morning in 1923, and the Forbidden City was quiet beneath a pale gray sky. Snow had fallen the night before, thin and crackling along the roof tiles. Inside the palace kitchens, located on the western side of the complex, servants were preparing a simple meal for the deposed Emperor Pui, who still lived inside the Forbidden City under agreement with the Republican government. The palace kitchens were ancient by then, sprawling, ploughed complexes of tile and timber, built long before electricity, long before gas. Fires were lit daily in clay ovens. Steam hung in the rafters. Smoke coiled along the ceiling beams. Fish was salted and dried in hanging baskets. Broth simmered in iron cauldrons the size of bathtubs. It was routine, boring, unremarkable, until a single stove used for boiling water was left unattended. The fire beneath it, fed with dry pine and kitchen scraps, crept along an oily floor mat. No one noticed until it reached a bundle of kindling in the corner, left for the afternoon meal. From there, it leapt to the walls, thin slats of wood, soaked with grease and years of careless maintenance. By the time the smoke was seen rising above the kitchen rooftops, it was already too late. The fire roared, and the Forbidden City, for all its symbolic power, had no modern firefighting equipment, no pumps, hydrants, no trained response. The palace guards tried to fight it, with buckets, with rags, with shouted orders and prayers. But the fire spread with terrifying speed, fanned by winter wind and fed by centuries-old timber. It jumped from building to building like a thing with memory. It reached the hall of military eminence, destroying scrolls, beams, inkstones, and silks. From there, it scorched nearby storehouses, including archives that had never been copied. Servants fled. Officials panicked. PUII, the last emperor, was rushed from his quarters barefoot, carried across snow-slicked tiles by eunuchs who no longer served the throne. By nightfall, over 200 rooms had been reduced to ashdot. The Forbidden City, designed to embody permanence, had burned like a forgotten village. The tragedy was immense, but the cause: one kitchen stove, one pot of water, and a system that, for all its grandeur, had quietly decayed. The fire did not begin because of sabotage or rebellion. It began because the palace was old, underfunded, and stuck in a world that no longer worked. The imperial kitchens, once staffed by hundreds and supplied through intricate bureaucratic channels, now relied on whatever servants remained. No inspections, no repairs, no oversight. The dynasty had fallen in 1912, but the fire made something else clear. The Forbidden City had not just lost its power, it had lost its memory. Newspapers at the time reported the event with dry restraint. Fire in former imperial kitchen destroys large section of palace grounds. Go. But behind the headline was something deeper. The public, long weary of imperial rule, did not rise in outrage. They did not mourn the scorched throne rooms or charred scrolls. Many welcomed the fire as a symbol to them. The Forbidden City was no longer sacred. It was a museum of arrogance, where emperors once lived apart from the people, surrounded by protocol and incense. A place where the divine right to rule had insulated rulers from real fires until now. One Beijing resident reportedly said, for 500 years, they thought the gods would protect their walls. But a kitchen fire doesn't care about dragons. Still, the loss was immense. Among the ashes were documents from the Ming Dynasty marriage contracts, property records, maps, imperial edicts written on silk, canes from forgotten artists, furniture from forgotten workshops, recipes written in brushstrokes too delicate to reproduce. Gone. All because a kitchen stove was left burning too long. So the question lingers. Even after the smoke clears, how much history disappears? Not in revolution, but in routine. Asterisked by dawn the next day, the fire had finally gone out, not because it had been defeated, but because it had run out of things to consume. The western wing of the Forbidden City smoldered beneath a sky of low gray cloud. Ash fell like soft snow. The palace that had once housed 24 emperors now smelled of burnt rice and wet charcoal. The air, usually still with incense and dust, was thick with a new kind of silence, one that followed failure. Over 200 rooms destroyed. Dozens more scorched and blackened timber beams, centuries old, cracked down their center. Bronze cauldrons warped from heat. Ceramic tiles shattered in place. Silk hangings reduced to cinders. The kitchens, once capable of preparing feasts for thousands, were a dark and brittle ruin. And yet, in the imperial archives, or what remained of them, the ledgers still recorded meals that would never be cooked again for those who had lived within these walls all their lives. The fire was more than disaster. It was humiliation. The Forbidden City, even in the years after the fall of the Qing dynasty, had remained a symbol, outwardly rigid, sacred in geometry, inwardly rotting. The fire revealed not just flammable kitchens, but how brittle the entire structure had become. And those left behind were not officials, not armies, but staff, eunuchs, concubines, minor court bureaucrats, people who had clung to a structure long after its foundation had disappeared. Many had no other home. They wandered the charred alleys, with rags over their faces, searching for anything that might be saved: a bowl, a scroll, a nameplate. One eunuch, named Lao's son, had worked in the kitchens for over 40 years. He'd been 13 when brought in, instructed in the 1,000 rules of preparation. It's a precise way to stack steamed buns for a Manchu feast, the proper timing of bird's nest soup. He survived the dynasty's fall, survived the warlords, survived the emptiness that followed. But the fire, it broke him. In a rare surviving testimony from a 1930s interview, Lao's son recalled, "The emperor lost his throne, and we still lit the stoves. We sharpened the knives, we hung the salted fish as if someone would return. When the kitchens burned, it wasn't just wood and oil, it was everything we remembered." What the fire revealed was a deeper decay. By 1923, the Forbidden City was no longer the beating heart of China, was a hollow shell filled with protocol and dust. The imperial household had been reduced to fragments, a few hundred loyal retainers, 24 surviving eunuchs, and a single deposed emperor, Pui, still allowed to live within the walls by the Republic as part of a strange compromise. Pui was just 17. He had been a child emperor. Now he was simply a tenant. The fire terrified him. He had never seen destruction that close before. In his diary, he wrote, "I was lifted from bed, saw the sky glowing red from the inner courtyard. The walls I had known since infancy were cracking in heat. I thought it was a sign from heaven that even as a former emperor, I had failed to protect what was sacred. And yet, no formal investigation ever held anyone responsible. No guards were punished, no ministers resigned. The Republican government, still weak and distracted by warlord politics, issued a few statements of regret, but there was no money for restoration. The palace staff patched the ruins with leftover wood. The kitchens were never rebuilt to their former scale. The physical damage was immense, but the symbolic loss is far greater because the Forbidden City had been more than a building. It was a story told in symmetry, in ceremony, in the belief that if the emperor followed the right rituals, the empire itself would remain whole. And when a kitchen fire could reduce that to ashes, the illusion was broken not by bombs, not by protest, but by a boiling pot left too long. In the years that followed, the Forbidden City faded further. Room by room, it emptied. Some halls were repurposed for storage, others for photo exhibits. Western tourists, slowly trickling in, saw ruins where emperors once whispered to the sky, and the staff who remained, God, they aged quietly. They told stories in the charred courtyards. They whispered about recipes never cooked, ingredients no longer available, rituals lost to time. Among the most mourned items lost in the fire were the palace cookbook's handwritten volumes listing imperial meals going back to the Kangxi era. They included not just dishes, but instructions for seasonal balance, proper color, harmony, and a banquet. The acceptable textures for morning meals versus celebratory ones gone, not looted, not censored, just turned to smoke. One archivist later described it as a famine of memory. And so we are left with this image, an empire that stood for 5 centuries, consumed not by war or politics, but by oil, wood, and a forgotten flame. Which leads us to ask, how much of history do we lose when we stop tending the fire before it burns everything down? Asterisk, the final count, as recorded months later by the surviving palace staff, came to 204 destroyed rooms. Gone were the West Wing kitchens, the hall of military eminence, several storerooms, servant dormitories, and multiple smaller courtyards, entire zones, a palace life lost in a single day. But there was no public mourning, no candlelight procession, no grand rebuilding ceremony. The Forbidden City did not weep. Asterisk. It simply continued, quietly, minus its West Wing. It is a strange thing when a building outlives its empire, when the walls still stand, but the meaning behind them no longer breathes. In the years after the fire, the Forbidden City remained a hollowed-out memory. The Republican government continued to allow Puyi to live within its boundaries. He was no longer a ruler. He was a boy in exile, living in a palace he could not command. After the fire, his world grew smaller, one wing less, one hall less, one memory more. In his later memoirs, Puyi wrote about the fire, not with grief but with resignation. He called it the day the air changed. The fire had eaten what the revolution had not. Where before the palace still smelled faintly of ink, sandalwood, and boiled beef, it now smelled of charcoal and uncertainty. It was not just physical destruction. It was a shift in tone, the sense that nothing was sacred anymore, that no one was coming to fix what broke, that the age of ceremony had ended, not with revolution, but with a burst of flame behind the kitchen walls. But not all was lost. In the weeks after the fire, a small team of historians, eunuchs, and scholars began sifting through the ruins. They wore padded boots and heavy gloves, carrying soft brushes and soot-streaked ledgers. Among the wreckage, they found fragments, charred scrolls, cracked porcelain, half-melted ladles, a few intact storage jars that had miraculously survived. Each item was catalogued by hand. One eunuch, Guang, 72 years old and nearly blind, recognized a burnt wooden spoon. He claimed it had once stirred the soup served to Empress Dowager Cixi. He held it like a relic and told it could no longer be used, he said. It was never just for soup. Another item discovered was a singed document written in Manchu scripta, menu detailing the Qing New Year feast of 1794. It listed 124 dishes, all arranged by temperature, texture, and symbolism. The final page was too scorched to read. They placed it in a box marked partial recovery. That label seemed to fit everything now. Partial, the Forbidden City. Post-fire entered a period of slow neglect. Restoration funds were thin. The Republican government, racked by warlord conflict and financial instability, could barely keep its own lights on. The palace became something between a residence, a relic, and a ruin. Some rooms were sealed. Others were repurposed. A few were swept and maintained out of habit, not duty. And the kitchens, never rebuilt in full. Meals for PUA were now cooked in a small adjoining chamber using modern stoves imported from Japan. The smell of open fire, once constant, now disappeared. The steam no longer clung to the rafters. The great copper pots were sold off quietly, their handles snapped for scrap. Only silence remained. Visitors to the Forbidden City in the late 1920s noticed this change. Western journalists described it as a city of empty doors and tired echoes. The halls no longer beat us to let. The kitchens no longer clattered. And though the throne still stood, no one sat upon it. But what did the fire truly destroy? More than rooms, more than recipes. It destroyed a continuity. The kitchens of the Forbidden City had once been living archives, places where knowledge was passed, not through books, but through practice. A dish made the same way for 300 years, each movement learned by watching, not reading. A sauce stirred clockwise 3 times for luck. A dumpling folded at just the right angle to honor a forgotten poet. All gone. Because when fire consumes building, it also consumes its habits. And habits are where history hides. Not in dates, but in details. not in the edicts of emperors, but in the way a palace servant tied his apron each morning, and how the cook whispered the names of ancestors while preparing the rice, in the silence observed before the first pot boiled. None of these were written down. None were preserved. The fire didn't just erase them, it scattered them to smoke, into memory, into rumor. Years later, when the People's Republic of China was established and the Forbidden City was formally converted into the Palace Museum, curators attempted to reconstruct what had been lost. They collected artifacts, they commissioned replicas, they interviewed surviving staff, many of whom were old, scattered, or unwilling to speak. But something had changed. The Forbidden City was now a museum, not a memory, not a home, not a heartbeat, just walls filled with explanations, clean, curated, cataloged, in the kitchens. A wing rebuilt in brick and cement, photographed, roped off, safe from fire now, but also from life. So we are left, once again, the quiet question beneath the red eaves. How many empires vanish, not with war or revolution, but with the spark no one bothers to stamp out? In a kitchen no one watches anymore. Asterisk in the winter of 1846. The Irish countryside was not silent. It groaned, not with the noise of rebellion or riot, but with the slow, aching creak of a society trying to survive with its hands tied behind its back, bound, not by war, but by paperwork. Great famine, as history would later call it, was not caused by an absence of food. There was food in Ireland. Barley, oats, wheat, beef, butter, all produced in abundance across broad green fields and calm rolling hills. Ships still departed from Irish ports, carrying full loads of grain and livestock bound for England and beyond. But the Irish poor, whose lives clung precariously to the potato, were starving anyway, because the system said they had no right to eat, and the system kept records, in ledgers, in shipping, manifests, in minutes from poor law meetings. There was no genocide declared, no command to let the people die. There was a philosophy, economic and confident, that structured who deserved help and how much and under what conditions. And for the Irish peasantry, that system had only one answer: not enough. By 1845, the potato blight had already begun to spread Phytophthora infestans, a rot that blackened tubers in the ground and melted them in storage. The first years, losses were bad. The second year was devastating. Fields that once yielded 6 tons per acre returned only slimy handfuls of pulp. The staple crop of the poor had failed, but not the country. Grain production remained strong. Cattle roamed in fenced pastures. Irish butter filled the cellars of London homes. Exports continued because the colonial government, operating from Dublin, Castle, and Whitehall in London, made a crucial distinction. Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, and free trade and altered, uninterrupted, was the principle that must prevail. To interfere with the market would be to interfere with the natural order. So they didn't. In the midst of this ideology sat a bureaucracy, layered, detailed, confident. In its ledges, there were the poor law unions, established in earlier decades, which divided the country into units responsible for their own paupers. Each union had a board of guardians, which board had meeting notes, which meeting had minutes, and each minute often meant another day of inaction. The poor law was based on the idea that poverty was a local issue. You helped your own, but when everyone in the village was poor, there was nothing to give. And so the letters poured in from local officials to Dublin, and from Dublin to London, requesting guidance, seeking clarification, awaiting allocation. The famine moved quickly. The paper moved slowly. One local relief official in County Mayo wrote in November 1846, "We have applied for oats. We were told to apply again. We have reapplied. Now the children are beginning to swell." No oats arrived. Workhouses were the state's response. Institutions designed to house the poor in exchange for labor. In theory, they were an answer to dependency. In practice, they were overcrowded, underfunded, and deeply feared to enter a workhouse. A man had to give up his land. A woman had to surrender her children. Families were split by gender, kept in different buildings, fed separately. A husband might hear his wife coughing through the wall, but he would not see her. Children, too young to understand why their parents vanished behind different doors, cried themselves to sleep in rooms filled with strangers, and inside, to work was meaningless. Breaking stones, unpicking old rope, turning mills that ground nothing. The goal was not production, it was deterrence, because if relief was too easy, it was sad. People would stop trying to help themselves, even when there was nothing left to try. And yet, the records were kept carefully, precise logs of gruel distributed. Hours worked, stones broken. The system was not chaotic. It was exact. Officials in London reviewed quarterly figures. They noted surplus butter, declining grain prices, spuchets exported on time, ASO numbers, not lives. One file from the Treasury Board, dated 1847, noted exports remain stable. Relief costs projected to increase by 2.7%. Recommend reassessment of gruel portions in Western Union. The note ends with no further comment. Meanwhile, in Connemara, a priest wrote, "They die with green mouths. They eat grass, hay, lie in the ditches, too weak to move. But still, the cattle walk past them, fat and silent." The contradiction was staggering. Not a famine of food, but a famine of access, a famine of will, a famine of compassion, interpreted through columns of ink and seals of approval. And so, in a land where food was grown, stored, and shipped, the people starved, because the law said the markets must flow, because the paperwork said the unions must wait, because the ideology said charity breeds laziness, because the numbers did not track human breath, which leaves a chilling question, still unanswered by the ledgers. If a society feeds its markets, but not its mouths, has it truly fed anyone at all? In London, the famine was often measured in units, tons of grain, barrels of Indian corn, pounds of meal distributed. Everything was calculated. Everything had a budget line. But in the west of Ireland, in places like Skibbereen, Ballina, and Clifton, life shrank to simpler terms. A spoon of broth, a patch of earth, a hollow stomach. The men who drafted relief policies rarely set foot in the counties they discussed. For them, the Irish crisis was a logistical dilemma, a spreadsheet, a question of efficiency. They read letters describing entire villages reduced to silence, but the ink never smelled of decay. The pages carried no hunger. The rooms were policies, were made, were warm. One such man was Charles Trevelyan, Assistant Secretary to Her Majesty's Treasury, a bureaucrat of immense confidence. Trevelyan believed that famine had a moral function, that it was, in his words, the direct stroke of an all-wise providence, meant to correct the over-reliance of the Irish poor on the potato. He was not a monster. He was devout, well-read, certain. He genuinely believed the famine would teach the Irish to be industrious, to modernize, to reform themselves. He was also the man most directly responsible for the pace, scale, and structure of famine relief. Trevelyan cut the soup kitchens. He delayed corn shipments. He insisted that public works schemes where starving men were paid to build roads to nowhere be run with strict economy. And still, he wrote letters praising Providence. In one document, dated February 1847, Trevelyan stated, "The problem of Irish poverty is being solved by the hand of God. We must not interfere with the cure." Meanwhile, the fields of Galway were filling with graves by early 1847. Public works projects had collapsed under their own weight. In theory, they were designed to offer employment and wages to the poor. In reality, they required men already starving to perform heavy labor building stone walls, carving roads into hillsides, often with no tools but their hands. One inspector reported finding a group of laborers attempting to break rock with shovels and wooden clubs. They were too weak to lift proper hammers. Many collapsed at the worksite. Others died walking home. Teas were delayed. Meals were withheld for minor infractions, talking too much, pausing to sit, failing to produce sufficient output per hour. But still the records showed progress. Miles of new road were completed. Bridges were constructed. Ledgers were balanced. Yet most of these roads led nowhere. They connected remote fields to empty hillsides. Some vanished into bogs. A few stepped midstream. They were roads built for accounting, not for travel, and they cost lives. In Skibbereen, the famine became so severe that it turned the village into a symbol. Journalists, priests, and doctors visited, horrified. A British relief worker described houses with 7 or 8 corpses on the floor, lying on straw, no clothes, no food, no sound. He was not exaggerating. One priest buried over 100 parishioners in a single week, most of them children. The government, when alerted, sent more forms. It also reminded local officials that they must prove their requests for aid were justified, and that any relief extended must not discourage self-reliance. Even as coffins ran out, even as people began to eat grass, nettles, and to bark off trees, a widow named Mary Collins was found dead in her cabin with 2 children beside her. A pot of boiling grass sat on the fire. Her body weighed less than 70 pounds. The local coroner recorded her death as due to exhaustion and misadventure. The state marked her case as non-qualified for long-term aid. All the while, food left Irish ports. It's a hard fact to absorb, but it is true. In 1847 alone, the worst year of the famine, called Black 47 over, 4,000 ships left Ireland, carrying grain, beef, butter, and more, bound for England. Some ships even passed starving towns en route to deeper harbors. This was not a secret. It was policy. The idea was simple. Ireland was part of a free trading empire. To interfere with exports would damage credit, trust, and balance sheets. Better to keep the economy stable even if the people were not taught. As one treasury official put it, commerce must not yield to sentiment. So the ships kept sailing, and the people kept dying. And yet, inside the system, many believed they were doing the right thing. The bureaucracy was not staffed by villains. It was staffed by clerks, assistants, secretaries, many of whom believed in justice, in order, in balance. They approved corn imports. They authorized new soup depots. They signed off on public works programs and called for better oversight. But none of it was fast enough. None of it was flexible enough, because the system they served was designed for another purpose, for managing imperial assets, not saving lives, and that system did not bend. It absorbed tragedy in the form of columns and stamps. One village might lose 300 people in a month, but on paper, it appeared as a relief application denied, insufficient verification. The deaths went unmarked, but the forms were complete. Some officials did break ranks. A few wrote impassioned letters. One English inspector in Roscommon wrote, "Have seen children eating the shoelaces of their dead mothers. I can no longer call this oversight. It is indifference wrapped in law." This letter was filed, not published. The famine was not a single disaster. It was a series of choices, made slowly, carefully, with ink and wax and good intentions. And those choices left over 1 million people dead. Another 2 million would immigrate, an entire country reshaped not by war, not by disease, but by a bureaucracy that thought it was being responsible that thought it was saving the economy, that thought suffering would teach discipline, that thought it could measure survival in pounds, shillings, and pence. So we return to the question too painful for ledgers to record. If the people die, but the system survives, what exactly has been preserved? Asterisk. By the spring of 1848, the famine was no longer a crisis. It was normal. The dead were still buried hurriedly, if at all. The weak still collapsed by hedgerows. The fields still lay fallow in the west, and the landlords still filed their rents from across the sea. But something had changed. Not in the system, not in the soil, but in the people. Those who could leave did. They packed their grief into bundles and boarded ships bound for America, for Canada, for Australia. They sailed away from the ruins of a country that still grew food, but not for them. They sailed away from the poor laws and the ledgers, from soup ladles and stone roads, from relief committees and requisition forms. They sailed away from what remained of trust. The bureaucracy, meanwhile, remained intact. Each week, poor law guardians still met. They approved contracts for grain. They recorded the number of workhouse deaths. They debated the definition of able-bodied, while starving women folded themselves small enough to fit into the rules. A girl named Noreen Donnelly, age 9, died in the Kilrish workhouse with only a crust of meal in her stomach. The entry next to her name listed natural causes. Her father had died on the road to Ennis, searching for seed potatoes. Her mother was already buried in a mass grave. No inquiry followed. The death was noted, numbered, filed. The irony grew heavier with each month. In Dublin, newspapers published food prices next to famine reports. On one column, export record, broken barley shipment surpasses 1830. On the next, Cork, 7 found dead in one dwelling. The numbers told two stories, one of growth, one of starvation. Both were true, and still, officials insisted that they were being fair, that any help had to be limited, that too much food would destroy local markets, that public generosity must be restrained to preserve moral discipline. So relief continued sparingly, strategically, slowly. One family might receive meal rations for 2 weeks, then be cut off for showing insufficient labor. Another might be denied aid altogether for keeping a pig, even if that pig was the only thing between them and the grave. The system was proud of its consistency, but the people began to see that consistency for what it was: indifference, wearing the uniform of order. There were moments of compassion. Some landlords opened their stores and fed their tenants. Some nuns and priests gave their last morsels to strangers. A few British citizens raised funds, sent barrels of corn, stood in Parliament, and wept. But those were interruptions. They were not the rule. The rule was that aid must be earned, and hunger alone was not enough. By 1849, the famine had reshaped Ireland forever. Entire villages vanished, just grass and chimneys and silence. Schoolhouses stood empty, graveyards filled with names no one would write again. Workhouses, once built to hold a few dozen, now resembled war. Hospitals rose of hollowed faces, lice, dysentery, rot. But the paperwork remained tidy. Receipts were issued, ration lists compiled, public works reports updated, as if the country had not been hollowed, as if 1 million people had not vanished from the land. Asterisk. And then, slowly, the famine ended. Not because hunger disappeared, but because there were fewer mouths left. The blight would return in lesser waves. Food supplies would improve. Some landlords would shift their strategies. Some policies would change. A new tone would enter the conversation, but the damage had been done. The people had learned that their government could outweigh them, that hunger could be moralized, that death could be scheduled. In the years that followed, The famine was remembered not as a policy failure, but as a natural disaster. Official reports used words like tragedy, calamity, and unavoidable, but the truth was simpler. The famine didn't kill because of weather. It killed because of choices. Choices written in calm handwriting, stamped with wax, filed in drawers, signed by men in clean coats who never saw a swollen stomach. Even today, in Irish memory, the famine is not just a historical fact. It is a wound, a silence handed down from mother to daughter, from grandfather to grandson, a pause in conversation, a name missing from the family tree, a cradle no one inherited, and perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of all, a famine that happened not for lack of food, but for lack of imagination, for lack of the will to change a rule, bend a policy, or see hunger as a reason to act, not a lesson to teach.